One of the biggest problems we have in the energy transition is people love to talk about it and write about it and make LinkedIn posts about it. But when it comes to actually trying to develop a new project, the unfortunate truth is that the institutional investor market in the US and internationally, made up of private equity, venture capital, ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds, so-called impact funds like the Bill Gates Breakthrough Ventures, and then a host of renewably focused infrastructure funds who are interested in project finance. All of them are working really hard to invest their capital in these companies.
Welcome to the Blue Ocean Solutions podcast, where we dive into real conversations with business owners, innovators, and industry leaders reshaping the future of clean tech, construction, and the renewable energy sectors. I'm Kreel Hutchinson, your host. Our podcast guest today is John May, the investor banker at Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital in the St. Louis area. Today, we're going to discuss his journey through the energy transition, from the early days of green investment to pioneering solutions that de-risk cutting-edge sustainable technologies. We'll explore how his firm is fueling the future of decarbonization and the role of AI plays in finding the next big breakthrough. If you're a founder of an early-stage clean tech company, or a renewable energy executive, or an investor looking for the next big opportunity in sustainable capital, you will love this show because John shares his unparalleled insights into securing funding for innovative green technologies and navigating the complex investment landscape. It's an example of how strategic financial innovation is driving a brighter, more sustainable future. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Thank you for having me.
I was really excited to have this conversation because a lot of my other podcast guests are looking to talk to people like you, people who have access to capital in order to bring their innovations, their entrepreneurial spirit really to the next level. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. For people who may not be familiar with you or your work in the world and your company, why don't you introduce yourself, share a little bit of your background and what you're currently up to?
Terrific. Well, I started my career as a practicing lawyer and got a little bit tired of that. So I switched over to investment banking in the early 1990s. That gives you an idea of how old I am. And I worked for an investment bank in St. Louis, my hometown, called Boatman's Bank. And that was my first experience as an investment banker raising capital for companies. And mostly what we did back then was first generation biofuels, as they're called, ethanol, biodiesel, renewable diesel. At one point I left Boatman's and went to work for Sturm Brothers, which is another firm in St. Louis that focuses on sustainability. And that's where I really ramped up my career. I did probably more project financing in biofuels than any other banker over the next probably 15 years. I'll mention some examples of some companies in a minute, but many of your listeners would remember the days of corn ethanol, biodiesel, moving on to renewable diesel, and then ultimately to sustainable aviation fuels. And that's where I really started to get noticed. I did the first two project financings in sustainable aviation fuel history in the U.S. Some of these names are so old that many of your listeners wouldn't probably remember them, but I'll mention them quickly. Red Rock Biofuels and Fulcrum Bioenergy were the first two SAF projects that were ever developed in the U.S., and I financed both of them. But here's where the story gets interesting for your listeners. Both projects, when they were built, did not operate at scale. And I remember coming home and telling my wife after the second project failed, I said, my career is over. And I thought she was going to give me a hug and try to comfort me. And instead she said, get your you-know-what out there and fix the problem. And then I had the best idea I've ever had in my life. And that was after the second project failed, I happened to be in New York talking to some friends of mine. And I went to lunch with a couple of guys from an insurance company. And I told them what had happened with these SAF projects. And they said, this is interesting. The insurance industry could create an insurance policy that would de-risk the scale up of first of a kind projects. To make a long story short, the first company that I worked with is a company that is called New Energy Risk out of New York City. And that was the first time that I started to use technology risk insurance in sustainable aviation fuels. And I still use it up to today. But technology risk insurance is not limited to sustainable aviation fuels. I'm using it in other sectors, in sectors like the marine sector. As some of your listeners may know, the International Maritime Organization next year is going to decide formally that the marine industry has to decarbonize, which means that marine fuels like hydrogen, ammonia, methanol, liquefied natural gas, or LNG, they all need to be either green or blue, or what is sometimes called low carbon. So blue, low carbon. So there's an enormous amount of fuels project financing to be done on an ongoing basis in SAF, but also in the marine sector. And so I'm really excited about that. I feel like that's another chapter in the fun of being an investment banker. Maybe I'll pause here and just say a little bit about my firm, if I can put in a short plug. After I left Stern Brothers, I had a call from John McKenna, who had been a partner at Lehman Brothers and head of the Houston office there. And he asked me if I would join Hamilton Clark, and so I did in 2016. John McKenna is the president of the firm, one of the most brilliant bankers in the fuel space. He started at Lehman working on oil and gas. And then when he left Lehman, he finally decided to take the money he had made and set up his own investment bank, which is called Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital. And that leads to sort of another point, which I'll make and then let you ask some more questions. But at Hamilton Clark, we basically work with early stage sustainable technology companies of a variety of types, and we help them raise capital. And the kind of capital that we raise is a series of funding rounds. We raise equity at the corporate level to allow these early stage companies to scale up their technology so that they're ready to do a first commercial scale project. And then obviously we do the first of a kind or first commercial scale project financing. And that's where the technology risk insurance typically comes in because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this on the podcast, one of the biggest problems we have in the energy transition is people love to talk about it and write about it and make LinkedIn posts about it. But when it comes to actually trying to develop a new project, the unfortunate truth is that the institutional investor market in the US and internationally, made up of private equity, venture capital, ESG, environmental, social, and governance funds, so-called impact funds like the Bill Gates Breakthrough Ventures, and then a host of renewably focused infrastructure funds who are interested in project finance. All of them are working really hard to invest their capital in these companies. But what remains as the biggest, I would say, anxiety around the energy transition is all of the type of funds that I just mentioned. All of those investors are concerned that if they invest in a sustainable technology company and the technology does not scale, that they could lose their jobs. No one ever talks about that. It's kind of the spooky music that runs behind or underneath the institutional investor market. And so the biggest, and I'll pause here, the biggest problem that I have as a sustainably focused investment banker is trying to pull in and gain the interest of these different types of funds to make investments in these companies, both for scale up and then for project financing. And in some cases, we go as far as once a couple of projects have been built, many of the companies will decide they want to sell themselves to a strategic in a mergers and acquisitions transaction. So we might sell a SAF project or several SAF projects to a large oil and gas company. Many of the oil and gas majors, as you know, Exxon Low Carbon Solutions, Chevron Technology Ventures, Shell Green Fuels. The oil and gas sector is starting to become a major strategic investor group, not just in the US, but internationally, in helping these sustainable fuels and chemicals and other technologies scale up. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John. You covered a lot of ground there. And sharing a little bit of, I would say, inside baseball with our audience of like what's happening, inside these boardrooms, but also inside the minds and the risk analysis of the investors. And so from hearing you, I think that the pioneer work that you did with technology risk insurance obviously laid the framework for more and more investment in this industry because it provided a bit of a safety net. Do you still see giving that you had made the inside baseball comment being like, hey, people are afraid of losing their jobs, so they're really kind of risk adverse, even though we're investing in new ideas, new technologies. They're not all going to be winners, but you got to throw enough of them out there. Even with technology risk insurance, do you find that appetite for being pioneers and maybe getting behind a project that could be one of these breakthrough technologies to radically shift, both decarbonization or environmental sustainability, whatever vertical that it's really hitting on? Do you still see that that's the biggest bottleneck for investors is a fear of them not having success and it coming back to haunt them?
Absolutely. And I'll take a couple of examples real quickly. We've talked about the fuel sector, but the other sector that's really incredibly important right now is the power sector in the US. And the fact that we have constraints on the amount of power that's available for the grid in the US. And it's a giant problem. Such luminaries as Jigger Shaw, who used to be the head of the US Department of Energy Loan Programs Office under the Biden administration, he's a personal hero of mine, but he regularly will post on LinkedIn about different approaches for bringing new types of power into the grid to provide more power, typically behind the meter, using new technologies that are being developed like batteries, energy storage, or what's called long duration energy storage, and other types of sources of behind the meter power that can help. And this gets into your point about AI. The whole point of that power is to be able to provide that power to hyperscalers and data centers. And that's the heart of the AI boom in the United States. And so there's probably no sector that's more on fire, so to speak, in a good way than the development of the data center infrastructure sector for AI. And so that's another area that we're focused on at Hamilton Clark, and I think it's going to continue to be a big area for a number of years because we simply just. I mean, I've even had people ask me about whether nuclear could be a source of power for the infrastructure sector, small nuclear reactors. We did a project financing for a company called Moltex Energy out of Canada a few years ago. And that was one of the first small modular reactor deals that anybody had done. And now you have a number of different nuclear technologies, nuclear technology companies out there looking to deploy their assets. Obviously, there's a huge weight there because they have to go through a lot of due diligence and approval from the governing bodies that govern the nuclear sector. But I think that's also a really interesting part of what we're going through right now.
John, what new mechanisms are still needed to bridge that gap between promising prototypes and commercial scale deployment, in your opinion?
I think the biggest thing that needs to happen that hasn't happened enough is private equity and venture capital are looking to do investments in early stage tech companies. And we divide it into Series A equity, Series B equity, Series C equity, and so forth. I think the toughest thing is actually doing a first of a kind project, whether it's hydrogen or sustainable aviation fuels or some of these marine fuels. And the biggest difficulty that I find as an investment banker is there has to be an investor who's willing to put in the capital to scale up the technology. So when you do a project financing for a sustainable fuels or chemicals or power company, there's three phases, and I'll be very brief. You raise equity at the corporate level for the company so they can scale their technology. Then they're ready to do their first project financing. And that's where the rubber meets the road, as we used to say. And what happens next is Hamilton Clark is asked by the developer to raise what's called development equity to pay for what's called front-end engineering design and other so-called pre-final investment decision items. And the final phase is the construction financing. The biggest problem in scaling up technologies is that middle round, development equity. The investors that I like to look for, that I think make the best development equity investors, are large strategic players. I'll give you an example. A couple of firms we've worked with are Mitsubishi Americas and Sumitomo. They have to wait for the project to be built, and that may take 1 or 2 years after the development equity is raised. And then, of course, how do they get paid? They get paid when the fuels or chemicals or power are sold to an off-taker who's buying the fuels, chemicals, or power. And maybe there's some incentives, like the Section 45 tax credits in the US. The EU has their own set of incentive mechanisms. You can also qualify projects for carbon credits, and you can sell those or monetize them, as you know. So to say that it's a complex opera, so to speak, of trying to get through these different rounds of capital, find somebody who will be the off-taker for the fuels, chemicals, or power that you're producing, and then having a set of incentive mechanisms that add additional revenue to the project developer, that's still evolving, and it's idiosyncratic. Each project is unique and different because Hamilton Clark, even though we're a U.S. firm with U.S. offices, we do work around the world, and every sort of major block of people in the world, whether it's the EU, Canada, Latin America, or Asia, they all have a different set of incentives. They all have a different set of restrictions on what types of raw material or feedstocks for making fuels and chemicals. So it's an infinitely interesting set, and it requires a huge amount of due diligence on the part of the bankers to make sure that they understand everything that's involved with these projects.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense, a lot of nuance there. How does Hamilton Clark effectively identify what I would call like the needles in the haystack, those companies with the most disruptive potential and viable pathways to commercialization?
It's a great question. Well, I'll give you an example. Our firm had a history of working in the battery sector, and there was a period, maybe a decade or so ago, when Mr. McKenna and some of the other senior partners at the firm worked on some battery deals. And then when we come up to present day, when we're seeing these constraints on the grid, and that batteries, sodium ion, lithium ion batteries, other types of energy storage, it's great because what you see is a gradual evolution of new technologies coming in that are being developed specifically for these solutions that are needed for things like getting power to the grid and so forth. So it's a continuing evolution, and that's also part of what makes the investment banking practice and sustainability so interesting. If you think about it, the so-called bulge bracket investment banks, we don't see them doing a lot of first-of-a-kind projects. The thing I love about Hamilton Clark is that's pretty much all we do. And we like that. We accept the anxiety associated with it, and we work our tails off to try to get these first-of-a-kind projects developed, whether it's in the U.S. or outside the U.S. And to me, that's the fun of the whole.
I would agree. You're on the cutting edge where you're really seeing awesome innovation occur. That's something that I've really enjoyed about hosting the podcast, because I've gotten to speak to a lot of great inventors, a lot of great technology, people that are in that group that you would be looking at. And so I'm thinking about them as I ask this question, so we can give them a little advice perhaps. In an industry often influenced by policy and political shifts, how do you advise companies to build resilience and a secure funding, especially when government support can be unpredictable or trends are kind of moving in multiple directions?
That's a brilliant question. I don't want to get into politics because I don't think that's appropriate, but what I would say is I'm going to give you an example of something that occurred this year. So, as has been widely publicized, the Trump administration did decide to cut the funding for the hydrogen hubs, which came out of the Department of Energy's Office of Clean Energy Demonstrations, or OCED. And I'm pretty sure I'm right about this, but I want to be careful. I think that Mr. Trump decided to cut the funding in the blue states that did not vote for him. And he left the red states with the federal funding that they were promised. And so what we've done at Hamilton Clark in a couple of instances is we've connected with a couple of the hydrogen hubs in the blue states whose funding was cut, and we've met with their senior executives and said, Hamilton Clark will help these, blue states raise capital through a typical fundraise process that we would do for a private company, going out and raising development equity and project financing. And I take a lot of satisfaction in that because I do think it's important to have fairness about how things are done and not have the future of these technologies subject to the whim of one person.
Sure. What would you suggest to smaller companies that are looking to basically get their project in front of investors or bankers so that it could be, looked over and evaluated to see if it has merits for investing in and moving forward? What advice would you give to those smaller startups that are trying to get in front of the right people?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, there are several what are called accelerator programs, which have a specific purpose of helping really early stage companies. So I'll mention a couple of programs that I think your listeners would recognize. The US government has the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which has a conference every year. There's a program every year that's called the Carbon to Value Initiative that groups together about 10 or so very early stage companies, and they provide a lot of advice. Usually these organizations have a lot of senior people that can offer tips on how to scale technologies and provide solutions. And the final example I would mention in the accelerator category would be the famous Greentown Labs. And I know your listeners would probably like to know about which conferences to go to. I think the best conference I've been to in the last few years is New York Climate Week, where they have not only US companies, but they have companies from all over the world, all of which have some sort of sustainable technology that they're trying to scale. So it's great that we have that set of programs and places for these early stage technology companies to try out their technology and start to scale it in a supportive environment. And that's critical. And I hope it continues in the future. We haven't seen much of that under the current administration, but I hope to see that in the future.
Yes, agreed. As you look towards the next 6 to 12 months, what is yours and Hamilton Clark's strategic priorities? Where do you see you investing or wanting to pursue certain areas? What's on your agenda?
I think the things that I've already mentioned, the power sector in the U.S., given the constraints on the grid, the leading expert on that is Jigar Shah, who's the former head of the Department of Energy Loan Programs Office, and maybe the most brilliant guy on the planet when it comes to understanding the power sector in the U.S. And I consider him a friend, so I think he's absolutely fantastic. And then we have to continue to decarbonize the fuel sector. We can't continue to have the fossil fuel lobby, which is something that's supported by the Trump administration, continue to pump out oil and gas exclusively. We need to start looking at green and low carbon fuels of all types for all sectors, but mostly for transportation and things like aviation and so forth. So those are areas that we simply have to continue to evolve.
As we move towards the finish line of the podcast, if you had a magic wand and you could wave this wand and there produce maybe one AI tool to solve one major challenge for Hamilton Clark, what would it be and why?
AI for me, whether it's ChatGPT or other platforms, have been incredibly helpful because AI has allowed investment bankers to have access to an enormous amount of information about early stage technology companies. What is the technology? What stage of evolution is it at? What type of capital do they need to raise? Are they at the Series A round or are they at the project financing round? I literally use ChatGPT almost every day. You can ask ChatGPT a question like this: give me a list of US technology companies involved with carbon capture. And in the space of a couple of minutes, as you well know, ChatGPT will give you a list of 5 or 10 companies, the names of the executives, a description of the technologies, and a whole bunch of other information. So what AI's already done is it has accelerated the education of bankers and other professionals who are in the sustainability sector to get to know these companies easily and quickly. And then obviously as a follow-up in a formal and appropriate way, reach out to the companies and say, hi, how are you? We'd like to talk to you about what you're doing and how we can help you raise financing. And before we had AI, it was much more cumbersome and slow. The only thing that I was able to do for most of my career was use LinkedIn, which is also a great platform, but doesn't have the kind of detail and responsiveness of AI, and particularly of ChatGPT and other AI platforms. So I think it's going to accelerate the decarbonization of every industry, because bankers and technology companies are going to gain that information more quickly and then act on it.
Brilliant. As we move towards the finish line here, I would love to make sure that you have an opportunity and my audience have the opportunity to reach out to you, continue to follow your work. Maybe they've got something they want to continue to chat with you about off air. What's the best way for people to get a hold of you, John?
Yeah, if you just go to my LinkedIn profile, it's John May, MAY, at Hamilton Clark Sustainable Capital. And I want to thank you so much for Kreel for having me. And I've really enjoyed being a part of the podcast, and I admire what you're doing.
Hey, thank you so much for being here. To our audience, of course, we will continue to put those details of our guests in the show notes. If you've enjoyed the show, make sure to like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with somebody that you feel could be beneficial of seeing a little bit of the inside baseball when it comes to investment banking inside the sustainable development industry. John, I'll pass it over to you. Do you have any final words for our audience, or anything that you'd like to leave us in a thoughtful manner with?
No, I think this has been great. I really am honored that you would have me on the podcast. I think what you're doing is really important. And thank you for the opportunity.
Great. Well, I wish you great success in finding the next big thing that really transforms our world and continues to move us towards a more brighter, healthier, and more sustainable future. So thank you for your efforts, John. Thank you for being on the podcast. To our audience, thank you once again for being here. This wraps up another episode of the Blue Ocean Solutions podcast. We'll see you on the next one.